Trump versus Bernie in debate. I am brimming with enthusiasm. So before we can think about who benefits or whether this is a good idea, let's contemplate what it might be like. And in doing so, we need to answer the question, how does Bernie usually respond to nonsense? Well, he might laugh it off. He's laughed off a good deal of what Hillary has said to him. Now there's the satire. As you get the bit on the Goldman Sachs speeches, for example. That must be great speeches. And by repeating the nonsense in an incredulous tone, then launching into talking points. So when you hit him on the guns, he just didn't understand what you were trying to say because it was nonsense. Like a CPU overloading. And going into a loop. So for example, let's say the topic of global warming comes up. So Donald over there thinks it's a nefarious plot by the Chinese to crash the US economy. So what exactly could Bernie say on a podium in a minute or so that is going to address that? How do you even begin to debate global warming with somebody who thinks it's a plot by the Chinese to crash the economy? And you have a minute. It's impossible. And so he won't. Rather, you're going to get something like this. You think it's a plot by the Chinese? Okay. But I think an economy where the 1% control, he's not going to be able to address anything that he says. So to be clear, Sanders will not be able to address a damn thing that Trump says. Because Trump will just spout out nonsense after nonsense after nonsense. And by the time you get to even understanding the nonsense, you've run out of time. I mean, where do you start with this global warming bit? Do you start with the IPCC fifth report? Do you try to explain that? Like, what do you do? How did this guy get here? It's a joke. So what is a debate in context? It's impossible, because Trump is consistently incoherent. And while that juxtaposition, Sanders is very coherent. So the juxtaposition may help in defining just how ridiculous Trump really is, and turn off conservatives that are warming to him. It's hard to see how it could present Sanders as anything other than confused, perplexed, and flummoxed. Because that's what any rational person would be when put on a stage and asked to debate with Donald Trump. They would have to be confused. Like Jeb Bush. And so if this is your first exposure to Sanders, there's a good chance he's going to come off as a stammering old man. They can't follow the... Bernie, we're discussing the idea that global warming is a plot by the Chinese. You're off going on about, the 1%. You can't follow an argument, can you? If you could follow the argument, we'd be talking about how global warming is a plot by the Chinese. Listen, I didn't make the world, okay? I just analyze it. Okay, don't blame me. But that's the reality of it. Is that if he's trying to appeal to Trump voters, he's not going to be able to address anything that Trump says. And these are Trump voters. People that listen to what Trump said, let it go over in their minds for a little bit, concluded there was some merit to it, and actually went out and voted for the guy. Or are planning to, anyways. People that think there's a lot of truth in the idea that global warming is being caused by the Chinese to crush the U.S. economy. People that makes good sense to. If you're not even going to address the argument, well, obviously Trump wins, right? He didn't even address the argument. He's just stammering on about something else. He's just changing the topic. This is what happens when you let this level of discourse exist at this level. You want to give nuclear weapons to South Korea? In an economy where the 1% could... So what's actually going to happen then is not a debate, okay? What's going to happen is that Sanders is going to get a primetime TV slot to stump over, while he shrugs incredulously at the incomprehensibility of Trump's positions. Sanders will have no option but to spend the whole time ignoring everything Trump says and just try to appeal directly to the voters. You think CNN wants that? You think Fox wants that? As MSNBC? Okay. No network is going to pick this up. And as for Trump, obviously, this is more of a... Obviously, he hadn't really thought it through. But it would be essentially equivalent to Trump donating airtime for Sanders. I will tell you this, though. Anybody that was leaning Bernie but considering Trump, if you put them together in a room and you make them talk to each other, nobody's going to vote for Trump after that. But the thing is that I think that the converse is true too. That if you take Trump supporters and you make them watch it, they're not going to support Bernie either. Because all they're going to see is somebody that can't follow the argument. As surreal as that is. I pointed this out a little earlier in the campaign. Trump's irrationality is actually an advantage if his opponent is rational. The reason is that rationality requires predictability. The best example of this is Reagan. It's widely understood that Reagan forced the Russians to stand down. I don't mean the coup, I mean collapse. I'm talking purely about the military. Okay, by increasing military spending through the roof, it's a process that happened in the 80s. Okay, the Russians stood down to the... Reagan increased military spending by some stupid amount. The Russians freaked out. They said, this is insane. We're not going to do this. This is irrational, and then they stood down. Right? They stopped. Instead of spinning the arms race out into levels that they couldn't handle, they let the Americans, build themselves into debt. They had their own debt canceled, etc. But, then he gets credit for winning the Cold War, right? Winning the Cold War. There's actually a kernel of truth in this, though. Okay, but let's understand how the Russians reacted. What the Russians realized was that Reagan was behaving irrationally relative to all their theories and models. You had generals on both sides running these game theory simulations against each other. One of the most famous results of this was the idea of mutually assured destruction. So, they would know that, if you launch an attack on one, then it'll result in an attack on yourself, meaning that it never makes sense, right? But it's broadly acknowledged that one of the major reasons the nuclear war didn't happen was that both sides assumed the other would always behave rationally, and that the other side always did behave rationally. So there was this kind of gentlemanly agreement across the two sides of the war that they would both analyze each other rationally and they would both behave rationally, and so long as that happened, nothing bad would ever happen. And it worked out. Okay? It led to unchallenged escalations, situations where, the Americans would know that, I'm going to do this, and because the Russians are rational, they won't respond. And also led to withdrawal decisions, situations where, people knew that they had to get out, um, because the other side is rational and they will take advantage of it, right? So when they became unable to understand Reagan as a rational agent, they had to stand down because they could no longer predict his behavior by assuming he was rational. What I'm saying here is that you can play the game so long as you know your opponent is rational. But once you become convinced that your opponent is not rational, the only rational thing you can do is stop playing. Because no analysis, nothing you could possibly do can understand your opponent's behavior. Because they're just not rational. You can think of it, like, I'm trying to think of an intuitive example here because I know I'm being abstract and it might be hard to follow. Let's talk about, I would talk about the Russians, so let's talk about chess, okay? You got two people playing chess. Now, people that are well versed in chess know that they have large amounts of, or chess players have large amounts of prepared plans sitting in their head. A lot of it has to do with, probability. If he does this, then there's a probability of that, et cetera, okay? And what it all bases itself around is you have to assume that your opponent is going to do something that makes sense, okay? Let's say that you start playing chess with someone and, they seem to follow rules that make sense for, most of the game. But then you get down to, a board where you've got some space on the board. You're down to your bigger pieces. Queens, rooks, kings. Maybe a bishop here or there. And then all of a sudden, your opponent just starts randomly putting pieces in places like you can't even do, right? So they start moving bishops, horizontally. They start moving rooks diagonally. Or let's even say that they're not breaking the rules so much as they're just, like they're moving their bishop back and forth, or they've got a if they have a fork, then they don't take either. They just start doing things that don't make any sense. But in ways that make your game plan impossible, right? All of a sudden, all of your probability theory that you've studied, all your game plans, all your unfolding is useless. And you're in a situation where you need to be able to try to predict what your opponent is going to do without any data, right? Except the certainty that your opponent may or may not take the option that is optimal, right? You may continue to play the game by taking guesses. Sure, why not? I guess that my opponent will move their rook over here. And so therefore I'll do this. But guessing is not certain, by definition. So there's a chance that you could be wrong. And in that case, the consequences may be dramatic. The other thing you could do is you could say, I am not playing this because my opponent refuses to behave rationally. And if you're playing a game of chess, you might get laughed at. But if you're talking about nuclear warheads, arms races, if you contrast the two situations where one possibility means that there could be a catastrophic event, and the other possibility means that um, you know, you might lose, but you know, at least you don't get bombed. Um, did you really lose? You know, the rational decision is to let the irrational person win. Let them think they won, or even really let them win. And that's what actually happened with Reagan. Um, Trump has taken to comparing himself to Reagan. And I know that there's probably a lot of people that are rolling their eyes. In truth, I think it's probably fairly accurate. I hope he's a lot less successful than Reagan, don't get me wrong. But they're both basically actors with no political experience, that are going to be largely reliant on the people around them, and that are entirely unpredictable and completely irrational. So I think it's an accurate comparison, but I don't think it reflects positively on Trump. I think Reagan was a lunatic, and we got lucky. So what the Russians realized was that Reagan was behaving irrationally relative to all their theories and models. You had generals on both sides running these game theory simulations against each other. One of the most famous results of this was the idea of mutually assured destruction. But it's broadly acknowledged that one of the major reasons that nuclear war didn't happen was that both sides assumed the other would always behave rationally. This both led to unchallenged escalations and withdrawal decisions, and I had already read that. So when they became unable to understand Reagan as a rational agent, they had to stand down, because they could no longer predict his behavior by assuming he was rational. They may calculate that a move is optimal, but their calculations become worthless when their opponent becomes unpredictable. Nobody should suggest that the lesson is that it is a good idea to elect irrational people to confuse the country's adversaries. It's not such a good idea, Reagan beat the Russians by being irrational, so therefore we should always know. This is not good thinking. Rather, we should be grateful that the Russians did not become unpredictable and irrational themselves, but rather remained rational even in de-escalation. Like I said, they could have decided they wanted to compete, follow the arms race out of logic and into craziness, but they didn't. They pulled back, and we should all be happy that they did. But it's going to put Bernie in the same quandary on question after question, okay? He's not going to be able to argue with absurdity. You can't argue with absurdity, especially not in a few seconds at a time. You can't argue with conspiracy theorists. You can't argue with religious people. And you can't argue with Trump. Rather, he's going to have to stand down over and over again. Although I will say this. If you have a good rebuttal for Bernie Sanders that he can say in 1 minute about how global warming was caused by the Chinese in order to, it's a plot by the Chinese in order to crash the U.S. economy, meaning that there's intent, right? The Chinese sat down at some point and said, okay, we're gonna create this thing called global warming, and we're gonna use it to crash the U.S. economy. That is actually seriously Trump's position. So if you can come up with a way that Bernie can respond to that in 45 seconds, I'd love to hear it. Post it on my page. Publish it. I'd love to see it. Maybe you can sell it to Goldman Sachs. It'll be worth a lot of money, I think.